Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, I have 3 big stories and 3 great guests. First, Donald Trump has extended his Iran ultimatum again. He says negotiations are taking place. There's another 10 days. Iran don't seem to be so sure. I'll be joined live by lead negotiator of Obama's Iran deal to find out what's going on. Really distinguished guest. Really looking forward to that. Then, the English-speaking world has become more miserable. Why? It's an interesting question. The data here, quite stunning, really. I'll speak to Banseka Kayembe of Naked Politics. And finally, Stephen Methven is back from Havana. He's in the studio. We'll be talking about Trump's next plan for regime change. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Is Donald Trump negotiating with himself? That was the accusation made by the Iranians about the US president earlier this week. And I mean, he's certainly not squashing the allegations. This was Donald Trump's ultimatum to Iran last Saturday, just to remind you. So this is what he said 6 days ago. If Iran doesn't fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the US will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. So that was last Saturday. In response, Iran refused to reopen the strait. They said if Trump followed through on his threat, they would bomb energy and desalination plants in the region. And then Trump had second thoughts. Basically, they won that round. So on Monday morning, about 12 hours before that ultimatum would have run out, Trump said there had been positive negotiations. And again, on Truth Social, he said, I have instructed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for a 5-day period. For their part, again, Iran denied negotiations had taken place. They still refused to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and their threat to bomb vital infrastructure in the Gulf remained in place. And again, last night, Trump has folded. So this is what he tweeted on Thursday. As per Iranian government request, please let this statement serve to represent that I am pausing the period of energy plant destruction by 10 days to Monday, April 6th, 2026 at 8 p.m. Talks are ongoing, and despite erroneous statements to the contrary by the fake news media and others, they are going very well. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. Again, I don't think the Iranians have come out and said, thank you, we did really want that 10-day extension. The negotiations are going well. They're basically saying he's negotiating with himself. They haven't, though, denied that negotiations are taking place at all. So we do know that there are communications taking place between the Iranians and the Americans. That's being mediated by Pakistan. Trump's post, though, so sort of his latest update, does appear to be contradicted by someone else. So not the Iranians, but Donald Trump. This was another post the president sent on Thursday. So the same day he says negotiations are going well, he says this: the Iranian negotiators are very different and strange. They are begging us to make a deal, which they should be doing since they have been militarily obliterated with zero chance of a comeback. And yet they publicly state they are only looking at our proposal. Wrong. They better get serious soon before it is too late, because once that happens, there is no turning back and it won't be pretty. So is Trump actually trying to reach a deal with the Iranians? Is he just buying time to strengthen US forces before a possible ground invasion? Or does he not really know himself? I'm delighted to be joined by a very distinguished expert on negotiating with Iran. Robert Malley was the lead negotiator of the 2015 nuclear deal between the US and Iran, which Trump would go on to rip up. He was also special envoy for Iran under President Biden and is now a lecturer at Yale. Robert, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Really do appreciate it. I want to begin by trying to clear something up, which is, as far as you understand, are negotiations actually taking place between the United States and Iran, or is lots of this going on in Donald Trump's head?
So I think much of it is happening in President Trump's head. I mean, we really have the first, postmodern president who makes things up and then hopes that the rest of the world will follow him. And if not, he'll keep believing what he said, even if it contradicts what he said 5 minutes earlier, as you just showed. Now, does it mean that there's no contact between Iran and the U.S.? Definitely not. I mean, I can't think of a period where they were not third countries, even when there was no active war, that third countries that were passing messages between Tehran and Washington. That's not exceptional. I suspect in this case, the US did present its 15-point plan. And at some point, maybe today, maybe it's already happened, Iran will come up with its own plan, which will be completely different, of course, from the 15 points that President Trump put on the table. But there's such a world of difference between that and what the president affirms, which is Iran is begging for a deal. I mean, if Iran is begging for a deal, then it's not clear why the president is threatening to commit a war crime in order to continue a war that was unlawful to begin with. So there's just so many absurdities in this. The only problem, of course, is these absurdities that are costing lives, and that could get even much, much worse. But I wouldn't take anything at this point the president says seriously. Yes, I'm sure there are contacts. I think the contacts reflect the fact that the president wants to end this war if he can, on his terms, and if not, he is very, very likely to escalate in even more dangerous ways with ground troops.
And so that makes it sound like you think a ground invasion is quite likely at this point in time.
I think it is. I mean, again, if you just follow the way the president has operated, I mean, he threatens something, then he walks it back, and he hopes that the Iranians are going to capitulate. I mean, he really does have this idea. I mean, this is a through line in his life, that if force doesn't work, more force might work, and other countries need to capitulate because it doesn't make any sense. As he said, they've been obliterated. How could they not be begging for a reprieve? And when that doesn't come, I think his next step may well be a ground invasion of some kind, whether he takes islands or whether he's trying to seize the enriched uranium, the highly enriched uranium that is somewhere under the rubble. I'm sure there are voices in his cabinet who are telling him, not so fast, and this is going to cost us politically. It may not even turn out that well militarily. But I'm not sure that he's listening to anyone, and I'm not sure that anyone who's talking to him is prepared to be firm, because, when you become an emperor, you hear very few dissenting voices.
And I want to get your thoughts on how this war is going militarily. Just a few reports over the past 24 hours or so. The New York Times yesterday reported that the 13 US military bases in the Middle East had all been so badly damaged that military personnel were having to work remotely. So they're working either from hotels in the region, or some of them have been shipped back to Europe. RUSI, so a UK think tank, has warned the US and Israel are running low on interceptors. The FT today had a report sort of saying that Iran still has quite a lot of weaponry to play with. I think the amount of missiles they're shooting every day, it did fall precipitously sort of after that first weekend, but has since leveled off, and it looks like they can do this for a while. So militarily, do you think Iran are winning this war as it stands?
That's a tough question to answer. Obviously, militarily, there's such disproportionate power, destructive power on the American and Israeli side that Iran can't compete. So at the level of just purely looking at military targets and what the US and Israel has taken out, including today, they've destroyed steel plants, which is a very vital source of economic well-being for Iran. So every day they're hitting they're hitting factories, they're hitting police stations, they're hitting military sites. So there's no doubt that they could prevail, just on the metric of how many things they've destroyed. There's another war. There's the asymmetric war that Iran is waging, which is a war that, as you mentioned, has not ended even the ability to dispatch drones and missiles. More than that, it's the ability to hold the US and the world economy hostage by blocking the transit of oil and of liquefied natural gas and of other very essential commodities through the Strait of Hormuz today, maybe through the Bab el-Mandeb on the other side if the Houthis get involved tomorrow. So, you could win one war, lose another. And I'm not sure at this point who feels more comfortable, who feels more like in the driver's seat. If you just listen to what President Trump says, it doesn't sound like he's the party that's winning. And if you listen to what Iran says, it doesn't sound like they're the party that's losing. Again, I don't want to paint a picture in which Iran has scored victory after victory. They are paying an enormous price, and the price they're paying is going to be felt way into the future, just in terms of their economy and in terms of their military capacity. But if you just take a snapshot today, the side that says it's winning sounds very much like a side that's frustrated.
And how big a story is the news today of those steel plants in Iran getting bombed, I think, by the Israelis? Because, throughout this, it seemed as if sort of the Iranians see bombing their civilian infrastructure as a bit of a red line. Their industrial capacity is very important to their warfighting ability, and also for reconstruction. And my understanding is they say, whenever you hit our civilian infrastructure, we will hit any civilian infrastructure in the region that we're able to. We see that as now a legitimate target, so long as the country is an ally of the United States. I obviously noticed that this bombing of the steel plants has also happened on a Friday. So is it the case that this is we often have escalations on Friday or a Saturday morning, then the markets go crazy on the weekend, and then Trump tries to calm them on Monday morning, because obviously the markets are closed over the weekend. Do you think this strike on the steel plants sort of sets us up for another big weekend of escalation?
Based on what, just the logic that you laid out, one would think that Iran has proven the capacity to respond and to retaliate more or less in mirror image. So I would not at all be surprised if the Iranians now, the regime decides that it's going to strike in a proportionate way or in a symmetrical way to go after civilian economic facilities in the Gulf or elsewhere. So I think that's the logic of where we are. And it's, the president says he's not going to strike energy infrastructure, but from an Iranian point of view, as you and I have said, these steel plants are very, very important for Iran. So wouldn't be surprised at all if you're going to see an escalation in terms of the targeting that Iran is going to undertake over the coming days. But that's the logic of this war. And again, in this asymmetric war, I really would analogize Iran to a party that is fighting a guerrilla warfare that is globalized. I mean, they're obviously weaker, but the asymmetric power of a guerrilla fighter is to find the vulnerabilities of its adversary. So far, it's done pretty well in that respect. Again, not to minimize the damage that they've suffered.
And you successfully negotiated a nuclear deal with Iran in 2015. We might talk about that in a bit more detail later. I suppose for now, I just want to know from you, would that have been remotely possible if your opposite numbers were on kill lists? Because at the moment, we've got a situation where the Americans are saying they want negotiations with Iran while they still haven't really taken off the table that they could kill any of their political leaders at any point in time. I think they asked the Israelis to take Aragchi and a couple of other people potentially off the kill list. But obviously, there's a constant threat of assassination of all of Iran's political leaders. And as someone who's been in high-level negotiations, has this ever happened before, where a successful negotiation has come out where killing the negotiator is not off the table?
I do have to say, yes, I've negotiated with Iran, but in circumstances that are so different from what we're facing today. First of all, I've served presidents I might have disagreed with, but never a president who is so unmoored from reality as the one, as you said, who's having a negotiation within his own head and who every day comes up with a new reality. I've never negotiated under this kind of fire between Iran and the United States, again, with the threat to the leadership with whom they're negotiating, and never dealt with, had to negotiate when the American party in this case, has not once but twice before in the middle of negotiations resorted to military strikes. So for all those reasons, one, without having any particular sympathy for the Iranian side, one could understand why they would approach these potential negotiations with a very, very heavy dose of skepticism. As you said, A, because it's still on the target list, B, because they've been betrayed before, and C, because it's a president who is capable of doing anything at any time for any reason. But again, negotiations often do take place while fire is ongoing, so that's not that unusual. I just think the circumstances in this case are such that for the Iranians to trust what they're going to hear from their counterpart is going to take a lot of persuasion, which is why I suspect that this war will peter out, not because there's this grand bargain, but because at some point President Trump concludes cost is too high, politically, economically, he's not gaining that much by continuing it, and he would hope that by ending it, Iran will reciprocate. So more likely to see diplomacy following it into the ceasefire than the other way around.
As a negotiator on the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, I assume you've developed a sort of strong familiarity with what the meaning of a nuclear program is, what Iran were trying to do with their nuclear program, what the threats are. And I want to show you a clip, you've probably seen it already, of J.D. Vance, so the vice president, speaking yesterday, and then I want your thoughts on it.
When I say options, I think it's important the American people know options for what? And it's options to ensure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon. You talk about people who walk into a crowded supermarket and have a vest on, and they blow up the vest and a couple of people get killed, and that's a terrible tragedy. What happens when what's on the vest is not something that can kill a couple of people, but can kill many, many tens of thousands of people? That is the most important American national security objective that exists for any administration at any time, is you don't want the worst people in the world to have a nuclear weapon. That's why the president is doing this. That's why the president cares so much about this particular issue.
So as someone with a genuine understanding of the politics of nuclear weapons, nuclear programs, should Americans be worried that one day there will be Iranians in supermarkets wearing nuclear-armed vests?
I don't even know where to start with what Vice President said or what the president and others have been saying for a while. I mean, let's just look at it this way. If the real fear was of Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, we were much, much better off with all, people could say it's imperfections, but with all of the limitations of the 2015 nuclear deal. When did Iran start sort of really exponentially growing its nuclear program to the point where, yes, they were 2 weeks away, not from ever having a bomb, but 2 weeks away from having enough enriched fissile material to develop one or more bombs. When did that happen? It happened after President Trump tore up the 2015 deal. So much worse off when the president tore up the deal. What happens in the wake of his military strike on Fordo last year, which in his words had obliterated the program? We're now in a position where we don't know where the enriched uranium is. It hasn't been destroyed. And we know that this is an Iranian leadership that, if anything, has a greater incentive and greater motivation to develop a bomb than they did during the time that the nuclear deal was in place. So he's tried this maximum pressure campaign of economic sanctions trying to strangulate Iran. It just exacerbated, intensified the nuclear program. He then tried a military strike, and here we are with no knowledge of or very little knowledge of what is the state of Iran's nuclear program, and a regime that is even more, if it could, even more motivated to get a bomb. So I think, several things could be true at the same time. President Trump made the situation worse. I think that's kind of incontrovertible. Had he not ripped up the deal, Iran would have been nowhere near the state it was back, on the eve of the June 2025 war. But it's also true that even when he waged that war and the war that just took place, Iran was not on the verge of acquiring a nuclear weapon. I mean, that's just, I think you have to listen. And no expert could claim that. Iran had not even resumed a structured military weaponization program. Again, the risk we faced was due entirely to two decisions the president took. One was to rip up the deal, and second was to attack Iran. That's what made the threat, if anything, greater. So, we could spend hours discussing the pros and cons of the nuclear deal. It's very rare that history offers us counterfactuals and live experiments that we could compare and contrast. I would ask anyone to compare where we were in 2015, 2016, 2017 with where we've been since then, and say, and come back and try to argue the case that President Trump has made us safer when it comes to Iran's nuclear program.
And I want to know your thoughts on what would be the consequences if Iran sort of does respond to this war, if Donald Trump retreats, by sort of developing a nuclear weapon. Because some context, I had Professor Sina Azodi on the show on Wednesday. He's not exactly sort of saying Iran must get the nuclear weapon and gagging for it, but he very much said, it's not the end of the world if they do. What happens when most countries get nuclear weapons is it's a deterrent, they don't use it, and sort of a nuclear Iran or an Iran with a nuclear weapon shouldn't be sort of this existential threat that people pretend it is. I wonder if you have a different perspective or a similar one.
I mean, there's a big political science debate about this. People have gone back and forth in terms of trying to figure out whether Iran with a nuclear weapon would be stabilizing, destabilizing, or basically a neutral factor. I mean, there's always been this contradiction among those who claim that if Iran had a bomb, they would use it, because on the one hand, they say we need to pressure Iran as if it could be a rational actor that would respond to pressure and to threats. But then suddenly when it has a bomb, it's going to be so irrational as to use it and therefore expose itself to immediate destruction. The truth is, there's no president that I know of, or no American politician I know of, who could take the attitude that Sina did, because it would be politically suicidal. So, again, we could have the theoretical debate. I think political science literature, I think, is pretty split on that. And they should point to India and Pakistan. The fact that they both have nuclear weapons means that neither side is prepared to really go full out in a war against the other. It hasn't prevented lower level intensity wars. So again, I don't want to go into the details of the political theoretical debate. I think what's a given is that no American president, actually not European or Israeli either, leadership was prepared to accept Iran with a nuclear weapon. I think that threat was hyped. But the point is, if that's your view, then there's many different ways to go about it. And the way that people have gone about it has, if anything, made the mentality in Tehran feel more attracted to having a bomb. I mean, just look at a few data points. If you're sitting in Tehran and you look at a few cases, you look at Libya, you look at North Korea, you look at Iraq, what do you conclude? You conclude the countries that either never had or gave up a nuclear program are the targets of either invasions, regime change attempts, and then the one country that has a nuclear weapon, even though it's not one that one would look at and say, that they're a stable factor in the world, is North Korea, and nobody's threatening them. And this war, again, if anything, if I were an Iranian leader, I would be tempted, if I could, to revisit what has been their nuclear doctrine, which is to be a threshold nuclear state, to always threaten the possibility of getting a nuclear weapon and not cross that line. I suspect that if they could cross that line now without being detected, they would do it. It's very hard to see them doing it because Israel and the United States have so penetrated their system that I think one or the other would detect any effort to try to acquire a weapon right away. But just in terms of the motivation, everything that's happened to the regime only, strengthened the view of those in Iran. And there always have been some who said, let's leave the non-proliferation treaty. It's not done us any good. And let's try to acquire a bomb because that's our insurance policy.
And in terms of the sort of sequence of events that led us to this, I mean, you negotiated the Iran nuclear deal for Obama. I'm not an expert, but to me it seemed reasonable. Donald Trump rips it up. There was an intervening presidency, though, wasn't there? The Biden presidency. You were Iran envoy for Biden. Should Biden have sort of put more political capital into trying to reopen the Iran nuclear deal? Would that have been sort of maybe the last chance to stop this happening? Obviously, sort of taking as a given that Trump is who he is.
Yeah. So, I've thought a lot about it. And I'd say two things. Number one, I do think the Biden administration came in with two thoughts that were two conceptions which were antithetical with getting a deal. One was the politics. I don't think that President Biden had at all the same view that President Obama did. President Obama was prepared to overcome domestic opposition, Israeli opposition, Gulf Arab opposition, even opposition from his own party, by the way, because he felt that it was in America's vital national security interest to prevent Iran from getting a bomb or from being dragged into a war to prevent Iran from getting a bomb. And so he put all his political capital on the table to get that deal. I think it was the right decision. President Biden, I think, doesn't come in with this being 1, 2, 3, maybe not even among the 10 priorities he had. So that's number one. Politically, he just was not that invested in it. The second, and this is what I discovered after I took the job, maybe unfortunately, was that there was this perception among the president and some of his advisors that, yes, they had opposed President Trump's decision to withdraw from the deal. They had publicly stated that this maximum pressure, economic pressure campaign was the wrong thing. But once they were in office, I think their thinking became, okay, we oppose the withdrawal from the deal and we oppose these sanctions. Why should we let good leverage go to waste? We have this leverage. Let's go back to the Iranians and say we want, quote, what became the famous expression, a longer, stronger deal. My view at the time, and I mean, I've said this before, is it's a nice thought, but it's a completely, I would say it's a destructive thought, self-destructive thought, because from the Iranian angle, what are they hearing? They're hearing President Biden, who campaigned against the withdrawal from the deal, now saying, number one, you Iran suffered because you've now had 2+ years without the benefits of the sanctions relief that the deal was supposed to provide you. Not only that, but now, because of the leverage that we acquired by leaving the deal, we're going to ask you to accept a deal that's going to be even more onerous and it's going to entail even more compromises from you. So I never thought that the Iranians would agree to that. And I think we wasted a month, 2 months of precious political time, which was the time when the more pragmatic, quote-unquote, Iranians were still in office, the presidency of President Rouhani. So I think that was a mistake at the beginning. I would also say I think the Iranians had their own self-conception, which turned out to be a little bit delusional and self-defeating. I think over time they felt they had a strong hand, particularly after the war, Russia war, invasion of Ukraine. They felt, the Russian oil is now off the market. Iranian oil is going to become that much more precious. So the Americans are going to come begging us for a deal. And I think they also had this notion that they wanted a guarantee that the United States would never do to Iran what President Trump did again, which is to withdraw from the deal. And all we could tell them is, there's no guarantee. We can't promise that if President Trump or any other Republican comes into office, that they won't tear up the deal. Either you think the deal is good enough, even if it lasts a few years, or not. And so by the end, if I think President Biden's team, we were we overplayed our hand in the first few weeks or month. I think by the end it was the Iranians. So there never was a moment where both sides truly wanted the deal. Again, as a self-criticism of the American side, I think there was this notion, that it wasn't that important to get a deal. We could live without a deal. We could live with this position of no deal and no crisis. I think that was very much sort of the implicit mindset. A deal is going to be too costly. We don't want a crisis, so we don't want to really go after the Iranians, but we can live with the in-between, and I think that was a costly illusion.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, if you had signed one, it is true that Trump could have just ripped it up again. If English is your native language, you might well be miserable, or at least not as happy as you used to be. That's the message from the new World Happiness Report, which shows English-speaking countries are tumbling down the World Happiness rankings. It's a trend visualized in this chart. So it shows the World Happiness rankings in each year since 2018. Finland has been the reigning champion this entire time. They've been number one every year from 2018 to 2025. Congratulations to them. Northern Europe is also well represented in the top 10. The English-speaking countries, though, we seem to have a problem. So New Zealand has gone from 8th to 11th, Australia from 11th to 15th, Canada from 9th to 25th, the US from 19th to 23rd, and poor old Britain has gone from a respectable 15th in 2018 to 29th now. And the Happiness Report is put together by Oxford University and the UN. The method is pretty simple. So they ask people across 136 countries to answer how satisfied they are with their life on a scale of 1 to 10. Each country then gets an average. So to give you an idea of what the results come out like, at the top, the typical Finlander gives themselves a score of 7.7 out of 10 for life satisfaction. At the bottom, the typical Afghan gives themselves just 1.4 out of 10. That's really, really sad statistic. Meanwhile, the typical Brit scores their life satisfaction at 6.7 out of 10. So not bad, but going in the wrong direction. Now, ever since they've done this report, they've found that wealthy countries usually do much better than poorer countries. More equal social democracies also score very well. The trends, though, so the movement, how this is changing over time, for richer nations and for younger people in richer nations, doesn't look great. So this is how scores have changed in Western Europe between 2006 and 2025. It's broken down by generation. So in the purple is Gen Z. They've gone from having a 7.5 score to a 7 score. Meanwhile, millennials in pink have gone from 7.2 down to 6.9 out of 10. Gen X and above have stayed fairly steady at 6.9. So interestingly, Gen Z tends to be, or historically has been happier, or younger people, I should say it this way. Younger people have generally been happier than older people in this report, but they're beginning to converge. Because the mental health of young people is deteriorating relative to older people. The trends are even worse in the non-European Anglosphere. So the report has bunched together the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Gen Z on this have gone from 7.8 to 6.8, so a full point they've lost. Millennials are down from 7.5 to 6.8. Gen X, again, have stayed fairly steady. So now Gen Xers, or older people, are happier, according to this sort of statistic, than younger people. So there's been a flip there. Now, before you get too depressed looking at those charts, we should say that overall world happiness, according to this report, has risen over the past 20 years, principally because lots of previously poor countries are becoming richer. So the standout from this report is Eastern and Central Europe, who have all gone up a point. And, looking at the report, it's not that everyone's sinking into depression, but there is something going on in the developed countries among young people, and specifically in the English-speaking world. So what is going on? I'm joined now by Banseka Kayembe, founder of Naked Politics. Your first time on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
What's going wrong? You're an English speaker. As an English speaker, why are we all becoming
something
more
integrally
miserable?
wrong with the English language, I think. No, I mean, I think there's just the obvious one, which I think it is partly economic, right? It's boring to say it's neoliberalism, but I think that's probably part of the picture. I mean, you've talked about some of these countries being richer, or the richer countries, but I suppose when we think about how wealth might be distributed in some of these countries, it's perhaps not distributed massively evenly, particularly when we lay that along sort of youth versus older generations, right? And we think about class disparity very much as part of how we kind of, how youth is distinguished now. Like, to be young in some ways is to be poorer, right? Like, those two things are quite synonymous. I'm not an expert on like Canada or Australia necessarily, but I think certainly here in the US there's been a kind of hollowing out, I think, of public infrastructure, youth services, serious lack of third spaces. And I think we're going to talk about this a bit more in a minute. I know about the sort of online space, but I think austerity very much kind of laid the groundwork for then this kind of empty vacuum where then the online world could take over, making us perhaps less happier. We've got less real spaces to exist in, and as a result of austerity, and then that's kind of been taken over by online spaces. I do also think beyond some of the economic stuff as well, I think we also, younger people in particular, like we live in this globalized world, social media, we've got access to see more about how other people in other countries might be living, right? Perhaps more than any other generation before. I was quite fascinated with like some of the China maxing stuff that we had like at the start of this year, and people were like drinking hot boiled water every morning, like on my timeline. And I was like, what is this about? And then I realized, it's a Chinese cultural thing, which I thought was really interesting, right? And so we can see not only ways in which, infrastructure in other countries might be better. It's great that the trains run on time. That'd be nice. But there's also maybe a cultural and identity thing as well. Not to sound like a right-wing talking point here or anything, but maybe there's also something we're envious of here about a certain cohesiveness and a certain cultural identity that feels more tangible in other countries than it is here as well. And I think finally it's kind of linked somewhat to, I think, a general sense of maybe purposelessness. I think work in the past has given us a more broader sense of, having a sense of purpose, right? And I think now work makes us feel quite atomized and quite alone. We don't have a sense of community cohesion. We don't form personal relationships in the way that we used to through our work, right? We become very alienated from it. And I do wonder if that's also part of the unhappiness. We're working more than ever before, and work defines our lives more than ever before. And yet it makes us deeply, deeply kind of unhappy.
I'm not sure we are working more than ever before. I mean, statistically, I'm sure we're not. I mean, they used to work 12 hours. They used to work 12 hours a day. But I mean, I suppose I'm always resisting these things of it's the worst it's ever been. I'm like, did you see the 1800s? Like, it wasn't great. But I suppose to put my cards on the table, I think a lot of what you've said makes sense. I think that probably, given that it's only the English-speaking countries and it's a trajectory, it's probably something that has changed since 2010 that has specifically affected English-speaking people more. And obviously, austerity, it was particularly harsh in the UK. I mean, it was also harsh in Greece and a bunch of European countries.
I agree, yeah.
It wasn't very harsh in New Zealand and Australia. So it doesn't necessarily seem like that's specific to these countries who've sort of lost a sense of happiness amongst their youth. Also, there's not much reason why that would affect sort of younger people more than older people. The property thing definitely would affect younger people more than older people. But again, why is that specifically in the English-speaking world? So my theory is that a hyper-competitive online media marketplace is making people miserable because everyone is incentivized to make the most sort of shocking, depressing content they possibly can. Like, we noticed it here. If you do a story, like often the more alarming you make your story, the more people are going to click on it. And online media has made this all so competitive. And then obviously, English-speaking media is more competitive than any other language. I mean, maybe Chinese if you're in China. But if you are in England, people in America, Canada, New Zealand, everyone is competing for your eyeballs. There's so much money in it. And I think if you're a French language social media user, there's just going to be a bit less competition. And it's going to be a bit less intense and in your face. So I think it's probably related precisely to the fact that we speak English
But
it's not a coincidence that we speak English.
Because there's quite a lot of other countries that we wouldn't be considered rich that do speak English, though, right? Like, or English is at least a kind of core language. Like in Nigeria, for example, like if I think of an African country where English is a dominant language, there's obviously lots of other languages as well. I'm assuming they didn't seem to be on that chart in terms of a massive drop of unhappiness. So what's the... Is that the main thing? I agree, it could definitely be a part of it. I'm sure it's not very good for our blood pressures that we're this alarmed, but I'm wondering if you've really isolated the real factor.
It's an interesting point. I haven't looked at the statistics for Nigeria. My guess, correct me if I'm wrong, would be that sort of people in England and America are in the same online sphere in a way that people in Nigeria aren't, because that's where the markets are. So obviously you've got all these content creators who are competing for eyeballs in America and Britain and Canada and Australia, because that's where people have like the money. That's who the advertisers want to show the advert to.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that it's sort of, we're being targeted with the sort of like, we need your attention, pay attention to this is terrible, that's terrible, you should be outraged, in a way that sort of, I imagine Nigerians are more watching their own content, but I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I was looking at the chart as well about Israel, which is quite high on that chart. I think it was like 8th in terms of happiness. And yet in my mind, I'm not an expert on Israeli media, but I assume part of the Israeli project is that you do have a somewhat alarmist media to kind of keep up the apartheid infrastructure there and stuff as well. But they're quite high on the chart, which stood out to me quite a lot, considering the country that's been at war for 3 years and, Yeah,
that's true. I'm sure Israel has quite a lot of alarmism in their media.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up an article you wrote this past week. I mean, it was published this past week. I don't know when you wrote it. So you got a piece out on Louis Theroux's Manosphere documentary in Tribune magazine. Who owns the Manosphere? First of all, I'm going to say why I thought this was relevant to this story, because you started your article with this quote. I watched the Manosphere documentary last weekend, and this was also the quote that really stood out to me, which was HS Tiki Toki, who I hadn't heard of before. We would show you the clip, but it's Netflix and this video would get taken down. So you've got to imagine it. I'm sure many of you have watched it. It was interesting if you want to watch it. And he said, the context here is he's like a really kind of nasty guy, really.
Yeah.
You can probably describe more who he is than I can. But he says, we live in an attention economy. With the attention, I can get more fame and monetize. And so I feel like this is very much English-speaking social media, hyper-competitive. There's just all of these young men competing with each other to get as many eyeballs as possible, which makes them all as alarmist, outrageous, toxic as possible, because it's just the market is too competitive.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was me explaining why I think this is connected to this. But explain the argument in your article.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's definitely a part of it, right? And I think one thing I quite like the documentary, by the way. Like, I think people got like the wrong end of the stick with that article. Like, I think people thought I was complaining about Louis Theroux. I thought the documentary was quite good. I didn't realise he had that many stans who were really, really batting for him. But I think one thing the documentary did really well.
Toxic fan base.
Apparently, sorry, Louis. Sort out your fan base. He was really good at demonstrating that this kind of expose of this pyramid of grifters, right? Or Ponzi scheme of grifters, whatever we want to call it, right? You had these kind of like top level manosphere influencer guys, your Andrew Tates, who probably are earning millions, I think. Your kind of mid-level ones, like this HS Tiki Toki guy. I'm going to call him Harrison Sullivan because I hate that name. His real name's Harrison Sullivan, who's sort of operating at that mid-level. And then you had these kind of like entry-level manosphere guys who weren't making any money yet. We're probably spending lots of time toiling away like digital serfs in this digital landscape to try and move up the pyramid and up the ladder. And I think the documentary got across very clearly that there is something corrosive about the economic incentives built into this system, which I think is very important to outline. Much better than a lot of other documentaries we've seen about these other more like analogous creators as well. There was one about Bonnie Blue on Channel 4 that was not really as good. So Louis did a good job in that respect. I think my main question coming out of that, probably thinking as a leftist, is who owns these spaces? Who maybe gets to profit the most at the top of that pyramid, right? And kind of getting to some of those root causes about, okay, to what extent is this about who owns these platforms? These digital platform owners who really do no work, really. Like, they're not toiling away creating this content for free, or some of them being paid. They're not doing much at all. And so I was quite interested in Yanis Varoufakis's theory around techno-feudalism. It's not a perfect fit because, albeit influencers don't pay rent in the same way that,
You do pay rent in the sense that they take 30% of your ad revenue.
Yeah, you can view that as rent.
I feel like our feudal lord is whoever owns Google at the moment.
Okay.
Is it Satya Nadella? Or
I don't want to upset your feudal lord. I'm very sorry.
I think he's maybe the boss of Google. But they take, most of our money, by the way, if you want to support Novara Media, go to support Novara Media. This is programmed into my tune. At the moment we talk about funding, I have to tell people the website. But our ad revenue, we work quite hard on this program, I like to say. There's a lot of people working on it. And they take 30% of all of it. Maybe even 45. I mean, it's between 30 and 50. They take all of it.
Quite a lot.
It's a lot because they don't really have to do anything to maintain the system. Like they've built a great product that people like, but then we're doing all the work, and it's exactly like feudalism.
Yeah.
Because feudalism, you work a third of the time for your lord, and you work 2/3 of the time for yourself, or sometimes it's flipped. But sorry, I interrupted.
No. It's a good point. I mean, I was at a YouTube event. I was telling you earlier last night. I wish I'd have said that to them. I didn't realize they were taking that much money from
you as well.
From creators. There we go. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think there was. I appreciate it's hard in a documentary to squeeze in everything because someone's always going to be like, you should have talked about this. But I do think that question of ownership, I hope we get to continue having that conversation at least, because it does feel like the manosphere is not kind of this singular problem on its own. It's not this, this problem that doesn't fit into a much wider problem, I think, that we have about just how much power, how much money, and how much control these people have over our work, our income that we generate. And there, I hope, should be a bigger question, much like we think about who owns land, we should also be thinking about, well, who owns these digital spaces that are also becoming really important, I think, to our economic infrastructure and stuff, right? And thinking about what does it mean, what would it mean for the public to own digital space as well as owning more collectively, actual land, right? I think that's and I'm not saying I've got all the answers, by the way, but it's made me think a lot about that.
I'm very much in favour of doing that because I don't like people being that rich, and I don't really like rent seeking. But I think the problem is more fundamental than that. I think the problem is competition.
Right.
And I think it's very difficult to get. I feel like there's too much competition for eyeballs. And I don't think it's just the algorithms. I think it's that we naturally like to look at more alarmist content, or not like to. We are drawn to look at more alarmist content, alarmist or sort of outrageous content. And even if there wasn't someone making a profit, unless you actively suppressed that, you would have a problem. And actively suppressing that would be a free speech issue.
Yeah.
Because so I think it's a fundamental problem whereby technology has created such a competitive media environment that it's got a bit crazy and everyone's miserable, especially, and the bigger the market, the worse it is. And obviously the biggest market is the English-speaking market. Yeah,
and I know there have been conversations about this idea that social media will have to push onto viewers certain kinds of content or try and prioritize it onto the algorithm, right? But then, of course, that brings about, so let's say like YouTube has to push BBC content because that's more verifiable. Like, that brings into question all kinds of ethical dilemmas, doesn't it, about the way in which information is being funneled to users. So it's not straightforward. I agree with that.
All right, one more little data point I wanted to look at when I was researching this today. I want your views. Because I think maybe one thing I got from your article as well was there is a tendency to sort of pathologize right-wing influencers more than anyone else. But it is left-wing social media users that are the most depressed. You saw this in the notes,
I did
right?
see, yeah.
So higher self-reported mental health correlates with conservative political views. So self-reported mental health, people who say it's excellent, 51% of conservatives say it's excellent. Only 20% of liberals do. This is American, so liberal means, that's left-wing. And how poor is your mental health? Liberals say, is your mental health poor? 45% of liberals say it's poor. Only 19% of conservatives say it's poor. So whatever toxic thing is going on there, it's worse for liberals than conservatives, which I think is a bit curious.
I don't know if some of that correlates to like wealth, but to be honest with you, sometimes I'm a bit skeptical of some of this data because I feel like people aren't always very good at like knowing where their politics sits a little bit as well.
Or if they're happy or not.
Yeah, like some of this self-reporting stuff, there needs to be a bit of room for error there, perhaps. I've been on dates with many men who said they were very left-wing and then the date proved otherwise, so...
Or they said they were unhappy and they actually seemed quite chirpy, or... both ways?
I don't know if anyone's been on a date and come out happier with me. I don't know.
Oh, my God. Well, Banseka, I've come out happier
Lovely.
from your first appearance on Novara Media. We'll definitely get you back on. Very enjoyable. How do people check out your channel?
Yeah, they can just look us up, Naked Politics, on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. And we have a website. We still do articles too.
US President Donald Trump is addicted to regime change. He wanted it in Venezuela and got a limited version of it. He wants it in Iran and appears to have blown up the entire Middle East to try and get it. And he wants it in Cuba.
You know, all my life I've been hearing about the United States and Cuba. When will the United States do it? I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it. You want to know the truth? They're a very weakened nation right now. They were for a long time.
As Donald Trump said there, US animosity towards Cuba is nothing new. The country has been under some form of blockade since the revolution in 1959. But Trump has intensified that slow burn economic warfare in recent months, including threatening sanctions on any states that attempt to break the US blockade. Most, including the United Kingdom, have immediately complied. It's a strategy explicitly designed to break the Cuban people and to not only turn them against their government, but to make them so desperate they eventually welcome a US intervention of some form or other. Russia has sent 2 tankers of oil to the island, with one now approaching the island. So that will test the US's resolve. Obviously, confrontation between the US and Russia involving blockades in Cuba has a worrying history, but let's hope it doesn't lead to nuclear war. The vessel is sailing under a Russian flag, meaning that any attempt by the US to board it would create an international incident. It is thought, though, that an earlier Russian shipment reached the island earlier this month. Now, the fuel, which the Russians are sending, which the Mexicans have stopped sending, which the Venezuelans have obviously stopped sending because they've had regime change, is very much needed in Cuba. Cuba was hit by 2 island-wide blackouts twice last week, plunging the entire 10 million strong population into almost complete darkness as the grid gave way under the pressure of fuel shortages. The siege has had massive knock-on effects in terms of transport, inflation, education, and of course healthcare, with hospitals reliant on generations and eventually manual ventilation to keep patients, including babies, alive. Not everyone is suffering equally, though. The US has been allowing exports to Cuba's small private sector, allowing 30,000 barrels through the blockade to service those enterprises. Very explicit what the Americans are trying to achieve. Drop sites Ryan Grimm was in Cuba last weekend to cover the Nuestra America convoy, which delivered around 50 tons of aid to the island. He's appeared on right-wing US channel Newsmax, where he described the impact of the blockade.
I toured the pediatric hospital. You know what the nurses and doctors there told me? They said when the power goes out, they immediately turn on their phone lights and race to the babies on ventilators.
Let me ask you this,
because there's a gap between hold on.
I understand.
Hold on one second.
We're killing babies with no power.
There's a gap between when the power goes out and when the generator kicks in. That can be up to like 5 or 6, 7 minutes. Yeah. A baby can die in that time on a ventilator. So they have to take their phone, turn the light on, race, and hand pump the ventilator. Because the United States has decided that Mexico can't sell oil and fuel to Cuba. What does that have to do with the United States?
The New York Times report published on Thursday spoke to 6 Cuban doctors, all of whom say the blockade is causing preventable deaths in the island's free healthcare system. It contains this detail on just how devastating Trump's sanctions, including those from his first term, have been on the island. They say until the COVID-19 pandemic, life expectancy and infant mortality rates in Cuba were comparable to those in developed countries, while doctor-to-patient ratios were among the world's best, according to the World Bank. In 2018, the infant mortality rate in Cuba was 4 per 1,000 births, lower than in the United States. By 2025, that rate had more than doubled to 10 deaths, almost twice as high as the US figure. That is really criminal. It's because of those kinds of statistics that the Nuestra America convoy to Cuba was established to take over roughly 50 tons of essential aid to the blockaded island. 650 delegates also converged on the island over the past 2 weeks to raise awareness of the consequences of Trump's blockade. Some arrived in Cuba by boat from Mexico on Tuesday, so they brought items like solar panels, medical equipment, sanitary products and other essential items. 2 boats from the Nuestra America convoy, though, appear to have gone missing. So the Mexican Navy now is involved in a search mission to locate the 2 vessels. However, we've heard from people who are sort of running this convoy, it's not necessarily the case that they are sort of missing or in trouble. Calculations by the organizations involved, so they're expected to arrive in Havana tomorrow. I don't think they're a motorized boat, so potentially it's just that there hasn't been a distress signal. Potentially that's fine. Someone who was in Cuba over the past 2 weeks, part of that delegation, is my colleague Stephen Methven, who joins me now, proudly wearing a new hat.
Hola, compañero.
Are you more communist since visiting Cuba?
I don't know if I could be more communist. I don't know if a trip to Cuba is going to make me more communist. I certainly know a lot more about Cuba, and I definitely feel much more angry with the US than I have for quite a while. Even given all that's happened with Venezuela, with Iran, with the murder of American political dissidents on the streets of America over the last few months by masked guerrilla forces, all of that doesn't compare to how evil I think Trump's blockade of the island is. I'm going to take this off now.
It's probably easier to take you seriously, you know.
Yeah. How evil Trump's current blockade of the island is, the way it's designed to collectively punish the people of Cuba, as you said, in order to instigate some kind of insurrection. And I don't know whether insurrection is on the cards, but it's certainly working in terms of crushing the spirit of Cubans. They are, as one person said to me, Cubans are a hopeful people, but they feel pretty hopeless at the moment. And life is really, really difficult.
Let's just talk about this, the flotilla,
Yeah.
or the convoy that, I don't know if you were part of it or you were reporting on it. Is it sort of inspired by the flotilla that went to Gaza last year? That was also sort of breaking a blockade, lots of global activists on boats.
Yeah, the Global Summit Flotilla, I think it's directly inspired by that because it's organized by Progressive International, and friend of the show, David Adler, is one of the organizers general coordinators of Progressive International. He was, of course, on that flotilla. And I think the idea, developed from there. It was going to be a flotilla entirely, but there was such global enthusiasm to take part in some breaking of this blockade of Cuba that it was expanded to involve delegations arriving by air as well. So I traveled with the Italian delegation. It was over 100 people on it. It was organized by an Italian organization called Let Cuba Breathe, who were generous enough to allow me to go as a journalist with them. So I wasn't participating as a delegate. I was really there as a journalist. And so I didn't take part in many of the sort of planned events that the delegates were on. I rather spent my time actually going around speaking to Cubans. I'd arranged some contacts in advance before I got there. I then developed further ones. I spoke to people in other parts of the island, not just in Havana.
And tell me about what were people saying? What were the people you were speaking to saying?
I mean, many different things. But one thing I'll say is that, people have this idea that in Cuba, people won't say how they feel about the government. And that is not true. People were very willing to be critical about the government. There is some caution, which is based on the idea that, if they say something critical about the government at this crucial moment, it'll then be used by American media and American politicians to justify the grotesque blockade that's currently in place, or to justify further action on the island. So there's this caution about their criticisms being misused. I mean, every Cuban has the right to criticize the government. But
they don't. I mean, sorry, just to clarify that do you mean the moral right to criticize the government? Because they don't. I suppose they were happy to speak to you, but they weren't willing to sort of go on camera and say their thing, right? Because it is an authoritarian regime to some degree. To a large degree.
I mean, they definitely, there is. So, okay, before we get into any criticisms of the Cuban government, I just want to set up the context here,
yes.
Right? There has been no Cuban government in existence since the revolution in 1959 that has not operated under US blockade, sanction, embargo, and now siege of some sort. So the Cuban government is always operating in a space of possibilities, which is strangled of many of the possibilities that other governments would have, right? Because they don't have access to the same resources. It's deliberately blocked. Their commercial, economic, business transactions are restricted by the US. What can come in and what can't come in is decided by the US at many points in time. What happens to their tourism industry is determined by the US and whether it allows people to travel there or not. So that is the overarching context of the government, many governments in Cuba since the revolution. We're now at the most intense period of that. And as one Cuban put it to me when talking about the authoritarianism of the Cuban government, is that it's a government that's under siege, and governments under siege develop a siege mentality. So it is true that there have been moments at which things have got worse. So in 2021, there were protests. The government clamped down very, very hard. 710 people or something like that were arrested. People received long sentences. Cubans are not happy about that. The ones I spoke to, that was a step too far by the government. But there's also a sense in which they understand that, you can't have the possibility of fomenting social unrest at this moment when that's exactly what the US government wants to happen. So there's this kind of guardedness about criticizing the government, not because it's illegal to criticize the government. It's illegal to sort of foment insurrection, right? That's illegal in many countries. You're not allowed to sort of plot against the government. But criticism itself, I encountered it openly. People didn't want to go on camera, that's true. Part of the reason people don't want to go on camera as well is because, again, that could be clipped, that could be used in various kinds of ways. There are also different degrees of commitment to the government amongst Cubans, and so people who are mildly critical can get called anti-government by people who are less critical, for example, and that can lead to consequences just socially. All I want to do is make the point that as I was walking around talking to Cubans, I didn't encounter anybody who didn't want to say something about what they thought about the government.
And let's talk about sort of the extent that this is an emergency, because obviously people watching this might be thinking, the story of America blockading Cuba is an old one, right?
Yeah.
It's been going on for 70. It's been an outrage for 70 years, but it's not just since Trump's second term. It's particularly since sort of January, isn't it? So it's sort of
it's Maduro.
Maduro was abducted. That stopped the oil going from Venezuela. But as far as I understand, it was more oil was going from Mexico, and then they sort of bullied the Mexicans into stopping exporting it, because otherwise they would have been sanctioned or there would have been tariffs or something like that. So it's really in the last 3 months that sort of the lights have started going off.
Yeah, so the way the siege works is that Maduro was selling oil to the Cubans at a discounted rate. Maduro then the government of Venezuela is then decapitated, again by an illegal action by the US, just kidnapping Maduro and his wife. And the oil is then stopped by the US, so there's now a blockade in place. But the blockade is intensified by the fact that Trump has threatened to heavily sanction any country that ships oil to Cuba. All of this is illegal, right? All of this is illegal in international law, that there should be a naval blockade of a sovereign state, unsanctioned by the UN or anything, and furthermore that there's this kind of coercive control of the rest of the world that Trump is exercising at the moment, where he's like, you do this and you're going to suffer. I'm going to punish you and your population in just the way that I'm punishing, not just the way, it won't be as bad, but in similar ways to the way in which I'm punishing the population of Cuba. That's the kind of bullying, abusive way in which this current blockade is operating. And
I don't feel like there has been. I think it's actually. We were going to talk about this as well, actually. Mm-hmm. There's been lots of pushback against the delegates who've gone there, sort of American journalists or activists or influencers, because they've said, they stayed in really nice hotels, they're there on a sort of government junket in an authoritarian country. There's something distasteful about that. I'll ask you what you think of that in a moment. I think what is undeniable is that it has been very successful, actually, at putting the Cuban issue on the map, because this is an emergency, essentially, and I don't think anyone really is talking about it. Fair enough, everyone is distracted by Iran. We're pretty much distracted by Iran most of the time. That's what we're mainly talking about on the show. But to have sort of zero oil going into an entire country is extreme. And I don't feel like there's been much international pushback. Obviously, you've been following it more closely than I have.
Yeah, it is extreme, and it's caused nationwide blackouts at the most extreme point. Hospitals have to switch over to generators. When they do that, there's a kind of lag in the people on ventilators. There can be a period where they're without power. Medical staff are then rushing in to manually ventilate patients in order to keep them alive until the generators kick in. That's just on the healthcare front. It's an enormous emergency, and it's not helped by the fact that Cuba's infrastructure is very old. It hasn't been upgraded. Part of the reason it hasn't been upgraded is because previous sanctions and blockades have meant that it's been difficult to get parts in. They're also so old that it's actually difficult to get the parts. Some people have said, Cuba should have upgraded its energy infrastructure a long time ago. They should have, sort of been planning for that in this kind of way. That's also difficult without access to, other governments can do all kinds of things by borrowing. Cuba can't borrow, right? It's not part of the World Bank. It's not part of the International Monetary Fund. So it requires other kinds of arrangements in which to do these things. And in Trump's first term, not this one, he made it even more difficult for Cuba to do that. So you had the Obama period where there was some normalization of relations between America and Cuba, and Cubans will talk about that as a period of a feeling of great hope, and a little bit of prosperity started to arrive because American tourists could come and that kind of thing. Trump immediately cancelled Obama's normalization program when he came into power. Joe Biden continued with Trump's sanctions when he was in power. So that's Democrats just as guilty as Republicans here.
I wouldn't say just as guilty. And the reason I would say not just as guilty is because I think not going back in is different from ripping stuff up. And as Robert Malley was saying, when it came to Iran, they were saying it's a big political cost if it's just going to get ripped up again. I think guilty, I wouldn't say just as guilty.
Well, if Biden had gone back to the Obama setup, Cuba might have had, better resources with which to deal with what's happening now. Better resources with which to deal with the COVID pandemic, which hit Cuba incredibly hard.
And just the context of that. So this is something that made it make more sense to me. The issue with the COVID pandemic was that the actual virus hit Cuba harder? Or is it that their economy is so much based on international tourism, and the international tourism ended, and they haven't really recovered from that lost income?
It's the latter, right? Yeah, I think it's something like 30% of the economy is tourism, and you might say the Cuban government overinvested or sort of relied too much on that part of the economy. They built the big hotels and things that they built in order to grow the tourism industry. COVID hits. The island is shut down for 2 years. People are at home, quarantined. The government continues to pay 60% of people's salaries throughout, and that empties the coffers, right? That makes a real hit on a country unlike ours, which could borrow in order to make up for the expenditure of COVID and many others. Cuba couldn't. So that creates an economic knock-on effect, which is still being felt today. And another feature of the wickedness of Trump's embargo now is it's deliberately exploiting the impact of the economic impact of COVID on Cuba, the collapse of tourism during that period, and prolonging its inability to recover from it.
There's a strange, it's not strange, there's a symmetry between the Cuban and the Iranian situations, which is that in both cases, there's long-standing hostility from the Americans, and then Obama sort of put down some political capital to sort of ease it. So in Iran with the deal, in Cuba with the normalization. And then Trump comes into power, and purely because he hates Obama. And I suppose, it was that he wanted to win Florida, and there's lots of Cuban exiles who really hated the normalization deal. In any case, for whatever reason, Trump has ripped up both of those deals, and we are now seeing the sort of acute consequence of that, or phase two of Trump, where phase one Trump, he rips up the deal. Phase two of Trump, he tries to do regime change. Do you think the difficulties having in Iran will affect the policy towards Cuba? I suppose, if you were being really I don't think this, but if you're being really optimistic, you'd say, because Iran has been so difficult, maybe he's going to give up on the whole regime change thing. I would say, the Cuban situation isn't really sort of incurring any costs for the Americans, so they'll probably continue doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's also the case that, like, clearly Trump is absolutely failing in his Iran project, but he might want to win somewhere, and that somewhere might end up being Cuba. I mean, the interesting thing, there's such personal animus from Trump towards Obama. It's like anything that Obama did has to be cancelled. And if you've seen like the way he adjusted the portrait of Obama in the White House and like the worst president ever and that sort of thing. And like, there's lots of criticisms to be made of Obama, but I think the Cuban normalization was, and also the Iran nuclear deal were both like positive things that he put in place. But I think what it shows is that, look, you asked me about authoritarianism earlier. People talk about Iran as authoritarian. They talk about Cuba as authoritarian. The US is very, very happy to work with authoritarian regimes all over the world. Saudi Arabia, no problem. They're massive partners, so massive partners of the UK as well. The Gulf states, which employ indentured labor, where they take people's passports and they're not allowed to leave the country, also have like media repression, media control. No problem. Cuba and Iran, very, very different because they're not amenable to US influence, US norms, liberal norms, and they have wealth. Iran has oil. Cuba has probably one of the most beautiful islands in the Caribbean. It has massive, massive tourism potential. These are countries which just cannot be allowed to be the thing that they are because they won't kneel to US influence, US imperialism, whatever you want to call it. And so there's two things here. There's animus towards Obama, who, I think was maybe more accepting and maybe thought there was a different way of doing foreign policy, which is through persuasion and diplomacy and welcoming. And Trump, who, has none of these niceties and, just wants them gone. But I think, as I said before, things are going so badly for him in Iran that unfortunately it might be that he has to do something in Cuba in order to have a result.
And you put out a video earlier this week, which people can see on our YouTube channel, and you've got another one coming out early next week.
Yeah, so I put out a video earlier this week, which was a kind of press conference I was at with Cuba's Deputy Foreign Minister, Carlos Fernandez de Cosio, who, you might have seen all over NBC and stuff. Recently, he's been doing lots of the US media rounds during these negotiations between the American and Cuban governments. Next week, I have, hopefully next week, depends on our capacity, a really good video with a young Cuban journalist called Liz Oliver Fernandez, who is an independent journalist operating in Cuba. She works with an organization called Belly of the Beast. And it's she and I walking around Havana talking, and I ask her a lot of questions about the government, about how it is to operate as a journalist in the country, about government criticism. It's a really interesting interview, I think. I
look forward to seeing it. Stephen Methven, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Happy to be back.
Thank you so much for joining me on the show. My thank you to Banseka Kayembe and to Robert Malley. And thank you for you guys for tuning in. Come back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.